Good morning. It is my profound pleasure to be with you today to celebrate the intellectual contribution of Professor Edmund W. Gordon to the fields of teaching, learning, and assessment. Among other things, I am a professor emeritus of education in the College of Education at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, as well as a working class Black man from East St. Louis. Now, I give you the last comment as a moment of just simply full disclosure. We're very fortunate today to have an extraordinary group of panels. Paul Mayhew is currently Senior Vice President at the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, where his work focuses on the adaptation of the methodology and tools of improvement sciences for application in educational settings. In that context, he has extensively explored improvement sciences, beginning with his tenure as Superintendent of Education for the state of Hawaii. Prior to that, he held several senior positions in R&D organizations, always focusing on issues related to measurement and learning. Professor Jennifer Randall is the Dunn Family Endowed Professor of Psychometrics and Test Development at the University of Michigan and the president of the Center for Measurement Justice. She is particularly interested in justice-oriented assessments and how they can serve as tools for liberation. Temple Lovelace is the executive director of the Assessment for Good, an inclusive research and development program housed at the nonprofit home base of the Advanced Educational Research and Development Fund. Assessment for Good seeks to create breakthroughs in assessment and affirmative assessment that improves the access of learners to opportunities for learning in learning environments. Professor Laurie Shepard is University Distinguished Professor at the University of Colorado Boulder in the Research and Evaluation Methodology program. Her research focuses on psychometrics and the use and misuse of tests in educational settings. Her technical work has contributed to validity theory, standard setting, statistical modeling for detecting test bias. Her research studies on test use and misuse have identified learning disabilities, have focused on high stakes testing, accountability, high stakes accountability testing, and most recently, the use of classroom assessment to support teaching and learning. Dr. Elham Zanvakali is a postdoctoral researcher at Teachers College Columbia, working on assessment with Professor Gordon. Her research interests include the role of the arts in educational assessment and second language learning. She aims to integrate the arts into teaching, learning, and assessment. Her research focus is upon the arts as a therapeutic and equitable space in which students discover and activate their unique and multiple relational beings, ways of knowing and understanding. The flow of this presentation will be as follows. Dr. Zanvakali will frame the discussion based upon her work with Professor Gordon in Washington. Professor Gordon will then offer comments on the emerging framework. Each of the panelists will then have 8 minutes to give their comments upon the discussion. The panelists will then offer reflection on their collective presentation. Next, we will have an opportunity to pose questions to the panelists, who will have 2 minutes to give a final word. And finally, and most importantly, Professor Laurie Shepard will provide concluding remarks. My introductory comments. I have known and called Professor Gordon my good friend for over 50 years. And because of that friendship, I have been a bystander to greatness, not only because of his intellectual power, but also because of his integrity and courage. One of the professor's exceptional qualities is that he attracts greatness. I have been a bystander to greatness, and the scholars on this panel and other places who have a passion for education and equity. And from these conversations with Professor Gordon, I have heard the echoes of greatness. I hear the voices that have inspired him and have enthralled me. I have also had the good fortune to call Professor Doxy Wilkerson of Howard University a good friend. Professors Wilkerson and Gordon are and were close friends and collaborators. If you want to understand courage and integrity, there is no better example than our friend Doxy. As I have listened to Professors Gordon and Wilkerson, I've heard the echoes of the great ones who've gone before and who exemplify champions of education and equity. I've heard the voice of Mordecai Johnson, the first Black president of Howard University, who shaped that university and changed the world. I've heard Ed and Doxy talk of W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a mentor to Ed and a colleague to Doxy. Imagine my surprise when Doxy confided that he thought Du Bois did not fully understand Marxism. I was surprised because, in my view, there was nothing that Du Bois did not understand. I've heard the voice of Thurgood Marshall, who challenged legal precedent and transformed education. I've heard the voices of Charles White, Elaine Locke, Toni Morrison, Stokely Carmichael, Zora Neale Hurston, Chadwick Boseman, Diddy, and Roberta Flack. All of these voices are a crescendo in my head, and I keep listening to them all the time. Now it is time to turn the microphone over to my colleague, Dr. Elham Zenvakali, who will frame the remarks for our discussion. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so delighted to be here today and to share with you the work that I have been engaged in with Professor Gordon in Washington over the past few years. It is an honor to be here and to have this opportunity to share with the distinguished panel and the audience and to learn from you. I'm going to start the presentation with a prefix or background to our work. The following slides will be an explanation of the key concepts that include pedagogical analysis, pedagogical analytics, relationality, meta-mentation, all at the service of justice. And the last slide includes a series of questions that will be the center of the discussion and responses of the discussants. Prefix or background. Pedagogical Analysis and Analytics, PAA, is oriented towards educational measurement and analysis within the context of human variation. It is inspired by the call from the Gordon Commission that educational assessment should serve and inform human learning and development. It calls for pedagogical practice and research that honors the differences in the manner learners function, the ways in which different groups know and understand, the varied meanings they assign to experience, and how these affect who we are and how we experience living. Pedagogical functions of analysis and analytics is to inform and improve instruction by providing evidence and insight that is practical and useful to educators, to generate and share insights that enable learners to adjust and tailor engagement with opportunities to learn day by day, to strengthen the field's capacity to employ methodological approaches to understand human competencies, social context, and personal identities influence human performance, and to promote justice and equity by understanding of human variation. PAA serves two important functions. Number one, to inform and improve learning and teaching, and number two, to be responsive to the demands of equity in pedagogy. The functional and relational analysis of the processes rather than the outcomes of learning and teaching transactions are sources of understandings of these processes. Here, we are less concerned with the status of the outcomes of learning than with the processes of the progressions and the becomings of intellectually competent learners. Rationale of PAA. Mixed method research are being used to integrate analysis and analytics. Analysis is to discern and uncover person-specific factors as intention and purpose in the explication of functional relations among variables in context and diverse learners. And analytics is to utilize descriptive, diagnostic, predictive, and prescriptive analysis from larger data sets in order to understand relations and patterns. Origins of PAA. The concern with PAA originated in 1957 when Professor Gordon began to work with a special educator, Elsa Hauserman. The professor was a psychologist assigned to work at the Jewish Hospital of Brooklyn, providing services for children with developmental disabilities. Elsie wanted to know how these children function and the conditional correlate of their successful performance. She valued what each learner brought to the learning situation and wanted to know how the child went about succeeding and failing. She produced an extensive report on each learner and the implications of the assessment for her pedagogical intervention as teacher. From this richly detailed report, Ms. Hauserman developed a set of lesson plans for the conduct of teaching and learning transactions with the learner. We have also been influenced by the functional medicine model. The word function is aligned with the evolving understanding that disease is an endpoint and function is a process. It is more about the dynamic processes according to Bland 2017. Functional medicine is both a personalized and systems-oriented model. It empowers patients and practitioners to achieve the highest expression of health by working in collaboration to address the underlying causes of disease. PAA is designed to give you a practice of the fully functioning learner or relational being across the four domains, which include cognitive, affective, social, and situative. Functional medicine and Gordon's call for PAA. Gordon has called for analysis and analytics of the pedagogical processes in their relationality each with the other. He refers to this methodology as PAA. Like functional medicine, PAA focuses upon integration of different systems to create a relational being through a qualitative, interpretive, and cultivative understanding of the assessment processes along with quantitative assessment. The focus here is identifying and addressing their metamentary challenges modifiable to context, organizing, assessing those challenges, and coming up with a dynamic, effective, dialectical, and collaborative pedagogical plan to integrate analysis and analytics. PAA's approach. It is a holistic and humanistic and integrative approach to metamentary well-being of learners that evaluates how each educational system is working, understanding, supporting, and cultivating the abilities of each student as a whole. It is an equity-based and personalized approach that empowers each student and teacher to achieve the highest potential of education by working in collaboration using critical thinking to address the underlying causes of successes and failures in an educational work. The learning person is a questioning and relational human being engaged in understanding the world around her. Relationality in PAA. According to Gerrigan 2020, in a relational pedagogy, the assessment and measurement problem shifts from a judgment about status to understanding the conceptual and functional analysis of the transactional processes of teaching, learning, and assessment, their context, and their consequences. Understanding such a system informs and improves learning in a relational being. A relational being is intentional and purposive with a will to survive, thrive, and flourish. Beings come into this world with unimagined evolutionary gifts and the legacy of being unique in the history of the universe. The wonder of DNA is that each being is unique. Untold and unimagined possibilities remain to be discovered within each and every being through PAA, metamentation, and the cultivation of educational transaction. Metamentation refers to the highest level of human mentation, where a meta-self is in charge of relational being. From a PAA perspective, metamentation is thinking about our thinking, feeling, social connections, and situative standing. It is a mechanism that monitors and manipulates the different aspects, variables, meanings, and perspectives of context in each domain. Operationalization of PAA. Human adaptation and learning are processes of metaphenomena, where the four domains of cognition, affection, situation, and social dialectically interact in transactions to create organic situations where they interpenetrate one another to enable adaptations, learning, and development. It is a kaleidoscopic pedagogical phenomena designed and managed by assessing, teaching, and learning persons engaged in learning and becoming. Documenting evidence for the processes of becoming include relational past being, which is history, relational being, which is present, ethnography, generativity, and discovery, and becoming future, which is discovery, imagination, catalytic probes, and creativity. It strives to generate evidence for the processes of becoming and of the functional processes involved in learning and teaching transactions. A suggested program of R&D to establish PAA. Descriptive and interpretive documentations of who the learning persons are, their salient relational characteristics, and the meanings they assign to the learning situations in which they find themselves. Clinical observation and functional documentation of the componential analysis of the processes of teaching and learning transactions and the relations among these component processes, their context, and their consequences. Exploration, discovery, and descriptions of patterns of relationships among these interacting components, their context, and consequences. And annotated probes and records of the interrogation of learning persons relative to their perception and interpretation of the experiences to which they are exposed. Questions for discussion. Number 1. How might we generate evidence concerning pedagogy that will inform and improve human learning? Number 2. How might we generate evidence for pedagogical analysis and analytics to guide teaching and learning? Number 3. How might we integrate relationality with PAA? Number 4. Is applying metamentation the key mechanism for the integration of analysis, analytics, and relationality? And number 5. How does the operationalization of metamentation and relationality contribute to the application of PAA in service of equity and justice? Okay, I'll pass on to Professor Washington.
Thank you very much. We deeply appreciate your framing the session for us. And now we're going to hear from our distinguished panels. We will have in order Temple Lovelace, Laurie Shepard, Paul LeMahieu, and Jennifer Randall. Each will talk for about 8 minutes, more or less. Thank you very much.
So we'll see if I can do 8 minutes. I don't know. This might be hard. So thank you, Professor Gordon, for the invitation to share the stage with my esteemed colleagues this morning. Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, it's your time. Mhm. You, yes, you're listening. Mhm. Thank you, Owen. If you want to follow Ernie Washington and me at our advanced ages trying to continue to do intellectual work, you need to find yourself one or two bright young people who can do the thinking for you. Thank you, Ellie, very much for covering a lot of ground. I hope our audience followed it. I'll try in a few words to give you my take on what we're talking about. Our concern for a model of pedagogical analysis and analytics owes its rebirth to findings from the Gordon Commission on the Future of Educational Assessment. The report from that commission held, among other things, that assessment and measurement in education can and should inform and improve learning. The idea owes its birth to Elsa Heisman, a special education teacher who taught me most of what I know about educational assessment and analysis. In the commission and its report, we were applauded for our vision. We were criticized for our failure to advance a blueprint. The commission actually failed to specify a model for operationalization. We talked more about our vision. Louis Gomez, a member of the commission and our most consequential critic, calls that vision a North Star. He reminds us that the real work is in translating that vision into operations, into practice. Now, I had retired for the third time when I noticed that despite the commission's finding, the field was not moving forward very rapidly on the operationalization of these concepts. So here I find myself coming out of retirement again, this time to try to mobilize several of my friends in the task of trying to figure out how do you do something that I have talked about for 60 years, how to deliberately employ measurement science in the service of learning. How can we better use educational assessment and educational measurement to support accountability? And at the same time, to enable responsibility for informing and improving human learning. We are embracing measurement for its capacity to support accountability. We are proposing analytics, analysis in the interest of understanding that enables the assumption of responsibility. I believe
that the educational measurement of developability may actually be limited in its capacity to generate such information. I'll repeat that one. I've grown to doubt that what we do in testing, assessment, and measurement can contribute much to what my commission is calling for. It gives us status information. It enables us to compare learners. We can even make predictions, but it tells us very little about what's actually going on or not going on in the teaching and learning transaction that the learner or the teacher can use to actually improve learning. I also believe that the analysis processes of assessment, teaching and learning, these we consider the fundamental transactions of pedagogy. I believe that analysis can generate the evidence and the understanding necessary to this task of improvement. Thus, we come to pedagogical analysis and analytics that this bright young scholar has described, a methodology for generating evidence from pedagogical processes more so than from educational achievements. The kind of data, the kind of information that we need to inform and improve learning. We argue that the analysis of pedagogical processes can generate the kind of information we need to actually inform and improve learning in human beings. Now we're asking of our colleagues at this convening, our colleagues who are discussants, to critique what we are trying to do. And friends, if possible, point us toward leads to the operationalization of such a model. We believe deeply that analysis, analytics, added to assessment can serve the interests of improving learning. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor. You make us proud. Now I think we can now turn to the panelists for all the gifts and contributions that they will share with us.
Okay, excited to kick us off this morning with our discussion portion. Thank you, Professor Gordon, for the invitation, not only for this morning, but for being able to collectively be with you, with my colleagues here, talking about PAA. So let me take you on a journey this morning. I don't know if I'm going to be the critic on the panel yet. I'm going to tell you a few stories and give you a few lessons. I'm going to take off my researcher hat for a moment. I'm going to take off my former academic hat. And I'm going to remember my time as a special educator. The first time I met Professor Gordon, he told me the story of his time with Elsa Huisman, an educator at the pediatric clinic at the Jewish Hospital of Brooklyn. In my line of work, we talk about breakthrough solutions. And I firmly believe that at that time, Mrs. Huisman, through her diligence to afford every learner the best educational experience possible, and during her collaboration with Professor Gordon and others, created a breakthrough solution in assessment. She believed that her praxis should be influenced by how each learner used what they brought to the learning situation or their assets, and that through that knowledge, she could create better learning opportunities that met their needs in an individualized way. While at that time, many of the assessment tools she could have leveraged would give her a score or reflect the status of skill development within that learner at that particular point in time. The assessment processes she created gave her and the learner so much more. If you've ever read about or heard Professor Gordon talk about the impact of Elsa, like he just did, you'll know that her pedagogical praxis had a profound impact on his work for more than 65 years. As we dig into operationalizing pedagogical analytics and analysis, I hope you will afford me some time to share with you 3 lessons from Professor Gordon and Mrs. Weissman. In each of these lessons, I'll share how Elsa's practices should be the foundation for the future. Then I'll set a charge before us that if we are brave enough, we can do as a collective who are committed to the assessment for the service of learning. I'll then end with the possible futures that we at AFG hope to be the case for how we will advance the assessment field 30 years from now, which, if you're doing the math, would be nearly 100 years since Professor Gordon sat with Elsa in Brooklyn in 1957. So here's the first lesson. See, I can't stop being a teacher, right? Here's the first lesson. Elsa teaches us that human variation is something to be embraced and understood, not diluted through the lens of standardization. Human variation, whether we're talking about race, ethnicity, gender, functional processes of learning, development, performance, or ability, and the intersections therein, are filled with a range of possible ways in which learners not only express who they are, but in how they approach and navigate their learning. There are so many that have pushed the field to think differently about human variation alongside Professor Gordon, such as Doctors Gloria Ladson-Billings and Camille Cantor, because our learners don't arrive in the world ready to develop within a prescribed set of benchmarks. As we think about 30 years from now, what do we hope will be commonplace about the role of assessment and analysis in the lives of our learners? What is possible when we create such processes that are truly in the service of learning? At AFG, we are exploring how we might better understand patterns of development across time. Every day, our learners activate and suppress specific elements of who they are in order to navigate the world that is unique to them. If an educator, caregiver, or their learner themselves understands those things, how much more aligned and supportive could their learning environments be if we knew that information? Through the research and development we do at AFG, we want educators to have at their fingertips the tools that allow them to see the richest possible picture of a learner and the variations in development that are critical to know and understand. This leads us to lesson 2. Elsa taught us that the pedagogical process is a bi-directional exchange, with teaching and learning at each end for both the learner and the educator. As Elsa conducted these time-consuming assessments, not so she could necessarily categorize what the learner didn't know, but to understand the functional elements of how they navigated the learning processes before them. She then leveraged that information to guide a pedagogical intervention on herself. Remember, Elsa valued learning more about how a learner approached a task more than the score they received at the end, so that she could use that information immediately to guide her next instructional steps. PAA argues that through the examination of learning processes over learning status, we can more immediately elevate mission-critical information that impacts the learning environment in profound ways. At its core, pedagogical analytics and analysis pushes us to rethink the intersections of teaching, learning, and assessment. How might we, in 30 years, imagine the role that assessment should play in teaching and learning? If we are to be courageous enough to adopt this mindset, to devalue the role of the score and rank as desired outputs of the assessment process, and instead elevate to a much higher prominence assessment outcomes that bring clarity to the processes a learner uses as they navigate their learning world, educators can fine-tune how they wish to facilitate opportunity-rich learning experiences for each learner in their classroom. We're trying to tackle this now. We're expanding how we more effectively understand the active ingredients that each learner may leverage as they grow and develop, and then how we design better assessment tools that support those processes. For example, what happens when we say that understanding a learner's math identity is just as important as understanding their math knowledge? to the point that our constructs around math learning by default include the social and relational aspects of a learner's being. When I have that information as an educator, it allows me to co-construct better learning opportunities that enrich all parts of the learner in meaningful ways through my instruction. Finally, we also learned from Elsa that an asset-based frame to assessment is key. Her assessment practices foregrounded the functions that a learner engaged in as they interacted with the assessment task, what they leveraged, when, and how, that allowed her to teach at the growth edges of a learner's experience. As Elham states, a functional approach to assessment empowers educators and learners to achieve together the highest expression of learning that can be possible. Our assessment practices should occasion the ability to understand the ways in which each learner activates specific skills they need across their home, school, and community contexts. Our practices should also provide crystal clear information of information on the lived experiences of our learners so that we can understand the ways in which they navigate the complex world around them. So as I wrap my remarks, I extend an invitation to you for join me in how we might reimagine assessment and how it must be different in 30 years, especially if we use the building blocks from Mrs. Poiserman and Professor Gordon. I imagine a future where our assessment tools are responsive, supporting our understanding of human variation. Our assessment tools must ride alongside a learner's learning processes instead of interrupting them. They must consider the measurement complexities around academic and affective domains and how each of these variables work together in a synchronous fashion, that we are expanding the opportunities for growth and educational mobility for each of the nearly 50 million learners in today's schools. Thanks so much, and I'll pass it to you.
I have to say an enormous thank you for the honor of being at this session. It is a session convened, I see Police Levine in the back, to honor Professor Gordon as an honorary AERA president. And so, Professor, speaking and from the cloud, so to speak, is how I think of you being on my shoulder, giving advice and offering encouragement. And I chose for my remarks to focus on his 1995 article that I think could be read in any of the sessions around this conference today, and people would not understand when it had been written. And it was published in the Journal of Negro Education in 1995 toward an equitable system of educational assessment. And he outlines the distinction between equity and equality in just the way you hear people offering that now as a new insight. He describes pluralism, that we are supporting kids to participate in a pluralistic society. He explains diversity and human variation that you've already heard in the previous panelists. It is rich with an understanding of the need to integrate teaching and learning. He speaks about curriculum embedded assessment, and people are discovering this today. And they should just read the pages of that text. I offer it to you. I hope that I and my colleagues have focused on the idea that if you're going to be serious about assessment serving learning, that you have to think about the processes, those interactions, and embed, Professor Gordon's word, embed assessment in the instructional processes. So in 2016, Bill Penuel and I wrote a handbook chapter for the Handbook of Research on Teaching. And we tried to take up this idea that you had to have deep understanding of learning if you were going to talk about that kind of assessment. If an intervention is postulated to improve learning, then the theory of action must be explicit about that theory of learning on which it relies, and components of the theory of action must be coherently linked to that theory. So that's the level of analysis that we're trying to get to. A learning theory explains not only the actions of the teachers and students should take, but also why and how these actions support changes in students' knowing, doing, and becoming. And then in 2018, Bill Penuel, Jim Pellegrino, and I wrote that to support equitable and ambitious teaching practices, classroom assessment design must be grounded in a research-based theory of learning. Compared to other theories, we offered that sociocultural theory was the most compelling because it encompassed the relational aspects of learning, not just the cognitive. And that those also, so we keep, I think, complexifying and coming to understand more deeply that yes, your math identity is part of learning mathematics. A little example then is why the literacy field has the example of kids sitting in author's chair at the same time that they're learning that feedback and hearing how your work affects an audience is part of what it means to be literate. So that's an example of getting to that next level of specificity. And notice, not one of us yet has said anything about a score. So the hardest thing is to imagine how the measurement versus the analysis will be part of that future that we're looking toward. So I was invited to talk specifically about how that claim that I made with my co-authors about ambitious teaching and assessment, equitable assessment, should be completely entwined because both derive from sociocultural theory. And so we've identified some elements that could be an aspect of ambitious teaching or could be how you would identify features of equitable assessment. You should develop a shared understanding of ambitious learning goals and features of quality work. That's an instruction for ambitious teaching that lifts up examples for what we want students to think about accomplishing. And it's a good place to begin an assessment effort. We need to provide rich and authentic instructional and assessment tasks. Authenticity is part of that 1995 article. Go back and read it. We want to draw connections between students' interests and funds of knowledge. So Louise Moll's talking about funds of knowledge comes after 1995, but it's in that same spirit. Well, maybe it's 1992. So this was part of what we all talked about at AERA in that decade. Youngsters here. You want to develop disciplinary discourse practices in a community of learners. That is part of what we mean by ambitious teaching. It's what we mean by the kind of assessment that provides insights so that those interactions are the source of evidence where I'm learning about the kids in my class. And it's also a practice that kids are learning to be disciplinary scholars, etc. Kind of watching the time and thinking, I won't read this entire list to you. The idea is that ambitious instructional practices interact with how we gather evidence. And the idea is to have substantive insights, not scores, substantive insights about, oh, I see what you're doing there. I know what we'll do next. And that's the spirit of this theoretical. They're deeply theoretical. We could act very academic about them. But they are also felt in ways that brings the relational aspects of teaching and learning completely together with cognitive work and cognitive growth.
Good morning. At 4:37 this morning, I was lying awake in a dark room and fueled by a potent mixture of jet lag and the insane idea that it's possible to organize my thinking at 4:37 in the morning. I was thinking about reinventing parts of what I wanted to say. Actually, I shared that just by way of apology for what you're about to hear. In order to understand my comments, which I think are relevant, somebody else apparently does also, and I believe that they help to elaborate some of the ideas we're wrestling with. It's important to understand just a little bit about the work in which I and a number of colleagues at the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching have been engaged for about a decade and a half now. We have been adapting, reimagining, developing anew the tools and methodologies and processes of improvement science for application in education settings. And this enterprise does aspire to exist as a science, and so there are a number of things about it that are relevant here, not least of which is that it is informed as a form of learning by a theory. It is theory-based and theory-driven learning, much as a good science should be. It involves public methods that can be widely understood, therefore critiqued, therefore replicated by others so that they can understand what you've discovered and learned. And they're based on evidence, measurement, practical measurement for improvement, as we call it, and a number of analytic tools. And since these methods have notably been used also to address the improvement of teaching and learning, the parallels really are quite striking in many ways. But they also, as a set of adjacent constructs and ideas, offer something of a unique perspective with which to look in on assessment and pedagogical analytics in the service of learning. So it's from that perspective that I'll do some translation as I apply some ideas from an analogous or adjacent field. A couple of thoughts. The first is, and I think we may well be onto something, me and my colleagues, because it echoes what we've been hearing this morning so far. One is, it really is important to see this enterprise not just as a technology or the improvement of a technology in use, whether that technology is the technology of assessment or the technology of analytics. It's important to look beyond or in addition to or augment or amplify to understand that there's also a system of use, an organization, a human organization, and a social organization around the use of these technologies that is as important in achieving desired aims. That there's no technology so inherently wonderful, and the pursuit of any technology, thinking that it will be so inherently wonderful, that it will do all of what we're asking, is misguided, absent serious attention to the human organization and the social structures that support the learning that this kind of assessment and analytics are designed to promote. Now, a few particulars. as regards the nature of that technology, the assessment and the analytics. First of all, as you've heard me allude to just a moment ago, and Laurie's comments speak to this as well, it has to be informed by, and the measurements and the analytics have to be directly and explicitly related to a theory of improvement. Or if you'd like, in this context, a vision of instruction, a vision of the interactions. One of the things that we have learned, and I would counsel, is that that vision should not aspire to be dictatorial. It should not be expressed as rote behaviors to be followed. And therefore, the technologies of assessment and analytics should not seek to prescribe behaviors so much as inform the judgments that give rise to behaviors. We call this privileging integrity of implementation above fidelity of implementation. It must be. In other words, by fidelity of implementation, we speak of understanding deeply the principles that animate a certain set of practices so that you can be true to them while adapting them to the needs and contexts, whether that is the human variation in the learner or the context in which learning is happening. To be able to adapt appropriately and to test what you do to make sure that it's effective is the way to fidelity of implementation. We urge it above a vision of teaching and learning that is prescriptive too much. Second idea, good assessment for improvement, or if you will, assessment in the service of learning and pedagogical analytics in the service of learning, should not aspire to causation so much as they should aspire to replicability. For people concerned about practice and the improvement of practice, replicability is actually the new gold standard. The trappings, the context, the conditions that ensure causal inference are too burdensome and best left to the places where they can be appropriately undertaken. Causal research. Causal research has an important role and place in any good science. We will continue to draw on it, but the science of improvement concerns itself with replicability. The idea that, informed by proper measurement and analytics, one could engage in behaviors, the purpose of which is to promote change that is effective, that is to say, it accomplishes what you're after, reliable, that it does so again and again across contexts and across people, and therefore can be done at scale, is actually the new gold standard. One last thought that I'll add. One of our guiding principles of this science of improvement is to see the system in order to improve it. The Gordon principles of assessment in the service of learning are important and they're wonderful, and they must be taken to heart in application to the assessments, in fact, that we build. Assessments to explicitly inform instruction, teaching, and learning. But they also need to be understood as part of a system in which other needs for assessments still abound. We have way too much assessment, the primary purpose of which is to inform accountability and the interests of those who live and work way too far from where teaching and learning happens. That I agree with. And it is not of a form that is particularly helpful or useful in the service of teaching and learning, and that alone is reason enough to attend to that assessment that can meaningfully inform teaching and learning. I readily agree. But we also have to balance the place of the new technology of assessments and pedagogical analytics that we may engage with these other needs in the system. Because to fail to do so is to pit these components against each other. And I fear that the cheap currency of accountability will win, as it has over and over and over again. So I wonder, for example, if it's possible to apply analytics to assessment in the service of learning and understand those insights in ways that are useful in an accounting way. An asymmetry, if you will. Forget about trying to make assessment for accountability serve teaching and learning. See whether or not assessment for teaching and learning can be managed in a way to inform accountability. We don't know if this could be true, but there are some abashing anomalies in which it's actually been approached historically in Vermont, New York, Hawaii, and Delaware, in the school districts in San Diego, Portland, Pittsburgh, and New York City through the 1980s and 90s. There are a number of examples. Unfortunately, we didn't learn nearly as much from them as we should have, and their accomplishments were lost when the call for efficiency of assessment resurfaced, and they ended up being in conflict with teaching and with assessment for accountability. So I would argue that we take those principles, the Gordon principles, and we be mindful of them as we look at the whole of an assessment system, not just those that we want to isolate from accountability and application in the classroom. Some thoughts.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to begin with gratitude for having the opportunity to speak with all of you, and also especially to the professor, wherever you are. I would just like to say, so that you know, so that it is clear that being able to think with you these last few months, to learn from you, to be in some way in service to you has most certainly been the highlight of my career. It is the type of thing that I feel 30 years from now, I will brag about to my completely disinterested grandchildren, that I was able to spend this time with Professor Gordon. So it is indeed an honor. And thank you so much for this opportunity. I am humbled by your presence every week, and that you listen to the words that I have to say. And because you are a generous man, I am confident that you will forgive me for these remarks and the ways in which they represent what seems to be the only song I know. I am very much aware of that. Sometimes I sing it fast, sometimes slow, sometimes with a whisper, sometimes with a scream, but it is pretty much the same song. And so I want to talk just a little bit about what resonates with me with respect to pedagogical analytics. And I think really it's its foundation, and that it focuses more on the functional and relational analysis of the processes rather than the outcomes of the learning and teaching transaction. At that it is less concerned with the status of those outcomes of learning than with the processes of the progressions. And I love how you say, and the becomings. And if we can agree that social justice is a journey and not a destination, and if you do not agree, you are wrong, then the relationship between the professor's thinking with respect to pedagogical analytics and my own thinking and struggles with justice-oriented assessment processes becomes a little more clear. I am interested in the ways in which assessment can be in service to a very particular kind of learning. How can the processes of assessment help to develop or elevate students' critical consciousness? It is through this learning process that I believe we can have the greatest impact. And I believe thinking about the role or the potential of integrating pedagogical analytics in this process can help us move our students along in this developmental process with a solid framing. If I can refer back to Dr. Eric Tucker has given us the stone soup allegory in multiple emails around the professor's work and what can we add, what can we bring to the table with respect to that work. So if I fall back on that story, this is what I would like to add to the soup as a complement to the pedagogical analytics already in the pot. The integration of an anti-racist approach to assessment. And when I say anti-racist assessment, I mean assessment processes that disrupt conventional racist stereotypes that perpetuate the marginalization of minoritized people, that call out and empower test takers to combat oppressive socio-political inequities and injustices, that provide a comprehensive contemporary and historical perspective that goes beyond celebrating or protecting whiteness. And I think the professor will appreciate this criteria, allows for multiple ways of knowing, understanding, and performing the content that are not centered in whiteness and the white supremacist hegemony. I think this approach or these criteria represent a very particular perspective with respect to the professor's vision. It provides an answer to the question, to what end? Learning to what end? Growing to what end? Developing to what end? In this case, the end is justice. Indeed, I used to believe that learning and growing back when I was a classroom teacher in and of itself was enough of an end. It's enough just to learn something. It's enough just to grow in some way. Age, all of my 48 years of wisdom has taught me that this ideology is naive if the liberation of my people is ever to be realized. And I recognize that this position is political. For the record, all assessment and measurement is political. I am just making my political leanings explicit and transparent. And why do I believe that the end of justice will still get the job done in a way that honors the professor's intent? I think it is because of this, and I hope, again, that the professor will agree. All humans, with all of our variations, are searching for meaning. How can we connect what we do know to what we do not know in order to further our understandings? Now, assessment should also support this kind of learning. Indeed, assessment should be for learning. This is where anti-racist assessment stands out for me and connects. Injustices are everywhere and in every space that students see, or worse, experience these injustices every single day. And for this reason, these types of assessments, the type that call for students to identify and think about how to mitigate socio-political injustices, preferably within their own context, will be inherently meaningful for students. Meaningful in that they represent where they are, but more importantly, because it will allow students to engage in thinking and growing about where we can be, what can we become. In describing the pedagogical analytic approach, the professor has posited that the learning person is a questioning and relational human, being engaged in understanding the world around her. A justice-oriented, anti-racist approach to assessment can hold this assertion or this framing because it, by its very nature, requires students to interrogate the world around them in critical ways. The ultimate goal, the end, if you will, being to disrupt systems of oppression. In other words, the ultimate goal is justice. Thank you.
I'm humble, pleased, I am inspired. I find this panel to be thoughtful, interested in justice, and committed to action. I'm totally and completely impressed with this crowd, I must say. I would also like to say that it's time now for some self-reflection amongst us because I sense a gathering consensus amongst that there seems to be a set of principles, a set of issues, a set of beliefs, a set of priorities now that might possibly galvanize us to kind of a vision that we've been hearing about. And so we've set aside some time now for some self-reflection among the members of the panel. Thank you very much, and I'll leave it to you, Paul.
I was asked to do some wrap up things, but we really wanted interaction first, and that's why there's confusion up here. Uh, and so I don't want to not take advantage of the time to maybe just come in a row to have a comment from each, so that we're kind of watching the time and also respecting our audience, and seeing if we can each have one more round because we hear in each other's contributions a great resonance with what the professor and Alan are offering and Ernest are offering in the first presentation.
So the one thing I love about being with amazing people is that you're always a learner. And so I've been sitting here writing notes, as if I'm in class. And um, the thread that I think binds us is where assessment should be placed. For far too long, I feel like we've made our learners to twist themselves into pretzels in order to share who they are because of the ways in which we leverage assessment in schools. The thread that I hear today is about how is assessment a tool that we use to support teaching and learning, discovery, and liberation as it relates to K through 12 education, pre-K education, post-secondary education, education when I too hopefully will be sitting and talking to my grandkids in 30 to 40 years about these experiences. And so as I think about the charge as it continues to grow, as we talk amongst each other, it's about to what end? What is the North Star? I do agree with you, Dr. Randall, that it is justice oriented. It's purposeful to justice, right? And that has to be our end to the ways in which we do our work and the ways in which we support their growth and learning that happens all across our schools. And so that's the lesson that I reflect back to us is to what end? And that end is justice.
So echo everything that Temple said without actually echoing it because that's irritating. And I will add that I want to call out some of what Lori was getting at is the importance of the assessment for students. I think you mentioned it briefly, of not even feeling like a disruptive thing that's happening in the process of their learning. If, as a community, I consider myself a part of the educational measurement assessment community, we can figure out how to do our work in a way that does not actually disrupt the work of teaching. I mean, right now we're talking about assessment in service to learning. But Lord have mercy, if we can just figure out how to do assessment that is not a disruption to learning, wouldn't that be fantastic? If we can knock that out in 5 years, then we can spend the next 25 years figuring out the rest. And so for me, I feel like that's an important thread that pulls through, figuring out what are the things that have convinced us systematically that our assessments need to be disruptive in order for us to get the information that we want. Then decide, is that information important enough to be brutalizing, particularly Black and Brown students every day in classroom spaces, and then making adjustments accordingly.
Yes, I'll take up right from that place, Jennifer, because an emphasis in what Professor Gordon has offered is processes. And Elsa Heiserman was thinking about how a learner engages. And that's part of what I am seeing. I would just like to also say that one reason, especially when talking about very young children, Jennifer and I have talked about this before, making it completely invisible. Because if I have turn and talk to your neighbor or come and report on this poster kinds of classroom practices, I can see what kids are understanding or not understanding without them having to have a formal event. So let me make a generalization about that strategy that's also worth our thinking about. We have to fundamentally change the meaning of evaluative practices and judgmental practices and positioning. And so just start layering on all the meanings that assessment and formal tests and sitting in front of a computer and answering questions has come to mean. So there is a huge set of things that we need to take up about how we want to change the meaning of assessment. That's why one of the practices of self-assessment is deeply emotional. If kids learn that, oh, I care about my learning and you are my partner in how we're going to take this up, and it's not threatening. But if you're in a classroom and you're walking around to different working groups and you say, well, how did you do that? And they erase, you know, you've failed, because that's the old way of thinking about assessment, which is, I must have done something wrong. No, I actually want you to tell me, how did you do that? What were you thinking? And we have to change the entire stance of what it means to interact around students' work, around their thinking, so that thinking is in the middle of the discussion and it's safe. And that's why different groups of kids have had different experiences with that. In fact, if you want to talk about privilege, I would say that's the biggest white privilege, is not being so judged by when the teacher asks you a question. And we have to take away that meaning of assessment. And every time we have external tests and teachers nervous about who's going to score what conveyed to their classroom, but that's part of the harm of accountability testing. And last comment, and that's what kids come to think learning is. So the sociological meanings of the assessment devices is what we have to work against when we construct very, very different environments.
I have two thoughts I want to share, and neither of them is new because they're both initiated and motivated by what my colleagues have already said. I risk stating the obvious, but then a wise person once leaned over to me in a meeting, and Ed Gordon said to me, literally, sometimes you have to state the obvious because that's the only way to find out that nobody sees it or understands it. At the risk of stating the obvious, I think there are two big things here that, for me, stretch over all. The first is, let the purpose of assessment and pedagogical analytics in service of learning be to inform professional judgment and decision-making, not to dictate behavior and practice. Put it together with some other ideas we've heard. Let that judgment be informed by justice-oriented perspectives and motives, anti-racist commitments, and the like. So to reprise what I was saying. There's a huge human side of this that is as important as the technology to be taken up for sure. But let the purpose in the first instance be to inform judgment and decision making, as it is, by the way, in functional medicine, not to dictate mindlessly the practices. And the second observation is one thing that I do hear in all of this is an important and profound call to action, an agenda to act upon, which resonates quite wonderfully for me. People who know me know that for decades now, 20 years or more, I've referred to myself as a recovering psychometrician. If we're able to do half of what has been proposed from this table this morning, I'll be able to come out of recovery. So, and that would be wonderful. What? Right. Oh, you never hear this, but uh, the first one is how might we? This is the driving force that Ed brought to our attention at the beginning of this session, namely, how might we gather evidence for pedagogical analysis and analytics? Strike you as kind of a potential outcome, which certainly strikes me as being there. I listened to Paul comment about it. Open style of improvement. And I've and it struck me that at the heart of it was a call for a shipwreck approach to science. Something that akin to a paradigm shift. And I feel and hear it and feel it in many of the comments that you've shared with me today. But, you know, I find myself at kind of a loss for how to take the first step. And I wonder, does it have to do with the fact that we're, we're, we're underestimating the sheer power on of the, of the past before? Because I think we're on the verge of asking for this, and we understand the individual consciousness, purpose, instinct, and how they're cultivated, practical thought, the quality. And I think that we have to sort of cut ourselves just a little bit of slack. Well, these are questions now for the coming century. Not just what, you know, of our past, present. Because it takes us right to the very edge now of where science is and where science is again. And so I think I'd like us to see if we can begin to sort of ask ourselves again now, how do we gospel and how it takes us to the places where, the data just won't go well. So we have to begin to forge new ways of thinking, believing, accepting, exciting, educating, and begin and find our way toward a new beginning. Thank you.
That's a good question. And to try to answer a question for the century, I don't know if I'm up for it. What I would offer is I'm not so sure hmm, that it's gathering evidence for pedagogical analytics and analysis, but it's the reorganization of the work that we already do. I don't. I mean, I say this as a person who truly loves the power that assessment, when done right, the power that's in it, right? If I can learn more about the lived experiences of the 8-year-old I'm sitting next to, or the 3-year-old, right? That's really trying to find their way around the world. I count that a privilege. And so I would offer that the evidence is lies in the ways in which it's not working, the evidence for why this method exists. The evidence lies in the ways in which, um, how do we begin to think about the role of assessment? And it's a systems change, right? It's an agent in the system in which we can begin to do things differently. And so that's what I would offer is that I don't know if we have to generate evidence for it more so than begin to think about how we reorganize our practices and what that North Star is within those practices. Yeah, I think.
Two questions from the audience because we're kind of watching for our final words, which would be like a minute each. And so we have time just for an audience question or two. So I see one there. Yes. I can actually invoke from the 1995 article. uh, I could imagine that Professor Gordon would answer in a pluralistic world, we are all border crossers. And so, what a classroom teacher figures out is what is shared and what is unique. And that's what our processes of interaction are that way. I'm getting to know my partner here, and we're both learning from each other. And if you think about communities of practice and overlapping and neighboring communities of practice, you are constantly um, deciding what is common. Sometimes, unfortunately, that is dictated by these standards that I have to put on the wall. Um, but even then, even with that mandate, there is a gentler way, a more respectful way of saying what the meaning of that common standard is in our unique and shared worlds. And I really think that we are negotiating expression sometimes, also, but it can be done in a way that recognizes what's coming and affecting kids. And I just think there's not one answer. It's always negotiated and felt. I hope that helps. But so now we're seeing 4 minutes, so we're good to wrap up. Yeah. Wahan, you wanted to say one last thing. Yes.
Uh, Following on your comments, I'm so humbled here. I just wanted to say that in order to apply pedagogical analysis and analytics, and in order to activate relationality, one of the practices can be the use of arts. The arts can create this space that will be helpful for the cultivation of the student. It can activate their multiple beings, and it can activate their understanding, different ways of knowing. When we create this art, this space for them, we have this equitable space when they can understand their ways of knowing and understanding. That's the only way that we can connect different domains of relational being their cognition, their affection, their social, and through arts they can convey their being and activating the social cultural theory, as Professor Shepard mentioned.
We only have 2 minutes. That means we don't have 2 minutes apiece. I did the math really fast. They're so patient with me. Thank you. So it's my pleasure, actually, as the elder person on the panel, and to thank everyone for attending. We want to thank Professor Gordon sort of for the honor of basking in his celebration and respect. I want to thank Professor Ernest Washington for convening us and organizing us. I want to acknowledge and thank Eric Tucker, who behind the scenes helped organize it. I want to recognize Professor Gordon's grandson, to whom we are offering all of this, saying there's a lot we expect of you. And of course, I want to thank my fellow panelists who are Temple Lovelace, Jennifer Randall, Ola Mayhew, and it's such a pleasure to have a shared understanding about how we're trying to enliven and come to have a deeper understanding of those processes of teaching and learning. And to Ernest's question about, so how would you, because it's so immense and, it's a century undertaking. And I would offer that we work at 2 very different levels. We advance the theory, and then we also attend to the particulars. So I offered you the author's chair when I heard that identity was part of learning a subject matter. And so there are specific claims in the theory that you can study and deepen our understanding with examples. And by the way, those are great examples for classroom teachers. We don't have to just be at this lofty level all of the time. And I feel like that's how we do our work, from the lofty theoretical to the ground, to what it really looks like interpersonally. That's why Professor Gordon comes back to what he learned from Elsa Heisenman, is that it's what we're trying in a bigger scale through the things that we see that moved us as being so important. And so blessings on everyone. Thank you for being here.